Botanical gardens often look quite different from natural ecosystems, especially because these are curated spaces. Plants that wouldn't naturally grow together are found side by side, and even native species often receive different resources than they do in the wild, such as more water or reduced competition due to weeding. The North American gardens at the UBC Botanical Garden, however, are being cared for somewhat differently. Instead of bringing together an array of species in a curated assemblage, these gardens aim to emulate the natural ecosystems that already occur in the wild. This means that the care they receive is different from other areas of the botanical garden, and decisions about things like the water they receive and the amount of weeding that horticulturists do are all based on the natural conditions. Welcome to Garden Ecologies. I'm your host Alison, and I'll be taking you into the UBC Botanical Garden to learn from horticulturists about how they're incorporating ecological and regenerative practices into their work, what that journey has looked like for them, and what they've learned in the process. Hearing their experiences, I hope you'll learn something new, find some inspiration to try new things in your own garden, and perhaps start to think about gardening in a new way. Today I'm here with Ben Storms, the curator and horticulturist in charge of the North American gardens, focusing specifically on the Garry Oak meadow at the garden, to talk about how recreating an existing ecosystem is different from other horticultural work, and what makes this garden a valuable educational resource.
So I'm Ben Storms. I'm the curator and horticulturist for the North American Gardens here at UBC Botanical Garden. And I've been with the garden 9 years now. And in my role, I oversee sort of 4 distinct areas that represent plant communities and ecologies from across the North American continent. One of them is an eastern deciduous forest garden, which is our Carolinian forest garden, we call it. Our Garry Oak Meadow Garden, which is a locally significant cool season meadow garden. Our Pacific Slope Garden, which represents largely conifer and chaparral plant communities along the coastal mountains from Northern California up into Oregon and Washington. And then also our BC Rainforest Garden, which is essentially a representation of our local coastal Douglas fir forest. And I oversee the horticultural maintenance, day-to-day stuff, but also the sort of medium and long-term planning for those garden spaces in terms of collections development and programming. And I work a lot with our education and outreach team to support the initiatives that they're undertaking to engage people in learning about and fostering an appreciation for all those plant communities.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested in talking specifically about the Garry Oak meadow ecosystem. Can you talk a little bit about what makes that ecosystem unique?
Mm-hmm. So the really special thing about it is largely in a regional context. So the Garry Oak tree itself is the only oak that is native to British Columbia. And it does extend further south throughout the states, and its range is much larger as you move through Washington, Oregon, and into California. But in a local context in British Columbia, that specific oak tree only occurs in sort of the southeastern kind of coastal areas of Vancouver Island and some of the islands in the Salish Sea between the mainland and Vancouver Island. And that's largely driven by a combination of sort of like climactic kind of factors interacting with one another, rain shadows from the Olympic Mountains, and then also the proximity to a warmer climate, a maritime climate. And so with that tree also comes a really special plant community, and that is the Garry Oak Meadow. So it's named for the tree, but it really is more than just the tree. It's the whole assemblage of plant community that comes with it and inhabits the same sort of seasonally dry, open forest, savanna type situation that it occurs in. And that's really, really different if you think about what the dominant forest cover is, or vegetation cover is, over much of sort of the lower mainland, which is like large conifer forests that are dominated by evergreen trees that cast really heavy shade. And there's some really wonderful diversity in that forest as well, but the diversity in the Garry Oak ecosystems is a lot higher in terms of plant diversity. There's more sunlight, there's seasonality, that drives a lot of different plant ecologies and adaptation strategies to the seasonal change. There's a whole lot of also then like insects and vertebrates and things like that that also occur in that meadow based on this really special assemblage of plants. So it's really unique, and it's actually the highest biodiversity of any terrestrial ecosystem in the province as a result. And it's really interesting because people think about meadows and they think it's just all open sunny locations, and there's a lot of that in the Garry Oak meadows, but what really also drives the diversity in them is that you do end up with sort of more foresty pockets and areas that have a little bit more soil depth or moisture, and so you end up with woodland plants occurring in very close proximity to these meadow plants as well. And so the whole ecosystem just has these like little niche microsites throughout it that foster a really rich assemblage of life.
The Garry Oak ecosystem is unique not only because it's home to such a wide variety of plant and animal species, but also because it has very particular climatic requirements, which is why this ecosystem is so rare. Given that this is such a particular biodiverse assemblage of species, I wondered how creating and maintaining this space differs from how other areas of the botanical garden are managed, and what the challenge of recreating this landscape is like.
The Garry Oak meadow here at UBC is still part of our living collection, so we still have accessioned plant material in there, and quite a bit of it, but it's maybe managed and tracked a little bit differently.
Accessioned plant material refers to the material that has been collected by horticulturists at other locations and brought into the botanical garden.
Meadow ecosystems, or meadows in particular, are full of plants that within the context of the garden we want reseeding and moving around in the garden, and so from a plant records perspective that can be a little bit tricky, right? Because we plant out a bunch of plants of one accession and then they start moving around within the garden into new locations and things like that. So the way that we track things, we try and be as consistent as we can with our standards within the garden, but there is a little bit of a different approach philosophically, in that we know that there are going to be plants that aren't that first generation seed that we planted over time, and that this is a natural thing that happens in these meadow ecosystems. In terms of sort of managing it from a horticultural perspective, that is also a little bit different in that garden space, in that it's a seasonally active meadow, so it's a cool season meadow where these plants are adapted to ecologies where they're growing and flowering and actively kind of doing their thing for a relatively short period of time in the year, and that generally is in spring, from, depending on the season we're having, March through to the end of June or into July. And as a garden that's open year-round, that's a pretty small window when you think about our overall garden visitation. And so horticulturally, in a lot of our garden areas, it's about making it beautiful and keeping it interesting and engaging to the public through horticultural display and the display of our plant collections. The Garry Oak meadow is interesting in that a lot of our visitation comes through in the summer season when that meadow is actually dormant. And so that's both a challenge and an opportunity, because it's a challenge to have people maybe change their perspective a little bit and their expectations on what they're going to see in the botanical garden. It's not all flowery stuff all the time, right? And so there's some challenge there in keeping people engaged and getting them to understand what they're seeing. And partially for that reason, the Garry Oak meadow, even though it's a relatively small footprint in terms of our overall garden, it has more interpretive signage in it than any other garden space to help people understand that what they're seeing, even though it's dormant, is still a beautiful thing and an important thing for a number of reasons: climate resilience, local plant communities, biodiversity conservation, all these sorts of things. So it's a little bit different than some of our garden areas that way. It also is an opportunity, though, for a number of those reasons that we're trying to interpret, is like to get people engaged in understanding that plants live in all kinds of situations around the world, and that looks different from place to place. And that's a really kind of unique and special thing. And if you can learn a little bit about some of the adaptations that plants have in your own sort of region for dealing with various climatic kind of factors and how their life cycle is quite unique, it can, I think, really make people appreciate those landscapes and become stewards for and advocates for the care and conservation of those landscapes. And yeah, from the horticultural care, I oftentimes am in this sort of constant flux of how heavily handed do I manage it horticulturally to make it sort of what we would call sort of classically beautiful versus managing it in a way that stays true to the ecology that we're trying to convey. And so, even something as simple as deciding if and when I'm going to give any supplemental water to that ecosystem to keep things blooming just that little bit longer, or green them up just a little bit, or in some cases even just like wash the dust off everything. Those sorts of things I always do try to balance the like quote unquote sort of expected beauty of that space while not compromising its true integrity too much. So like I could water the heck out of it and keep it lush and green and growing all year round, but then we're not really conveying what that ecosystem is really about, and it's sort of a missed opportunity. So I kind of try and balance those two things where I'm keeping it interesting, keeping it looking beautiful, while also allowing people to see that beauty throughout all kind of iterations of that ecosystem.
That's great that people have the opportunity to see that, like in my experience going to other botanical gardens, you do get to see a lot of beautiful plants, but it's not often like this is, how this ecosystem looks in the real world.
I've tried to just sort of take that idea and run with it, and I could have taken it and kind of gone the other way with it and still had the same ecology and had the same sort of like approach, but in a much more sort of like heavily designed way with a lot more control on what was moving where, when, and things like that. But I've sort of stepped back a little bit. We've addressed a number of invasive species in that meadow, and now that we're at a point where we have some of those, don't want to say like completely under control, but a manageable level of control, I'm happy to kind of let a lot of the sort of unfolding of that meadow and the maturation and plants finding their own little favorite spots and things like that in the meadow. I think that's kind of half the fun, is that it kind of stays the same every year, and yet it's always different every year a little bit as well as a result of that.
Working in the Garry Oak meadow year after year, Ben has had the opportunity to observe the phenology, or the cyclic and seasonal natural phenomena that occur within the garden, such as when specific plants bloom or go to seed. And I wondered how this seasonal timing showed up in the garden and how it impacted his approach to work.
So meadow gardens and meadow-inspired kind of gardens are really like popular right now. They're a really hot topic. They're great for all kinds of reasons. And they're oftentimes touted as low maintenance, and they can be, but no garden is no maintenance. I mean, that's one of the kind of foundational things that defines a garden. It's a space that is actively sort of like managed and has this intervention in it. And so it's really important in meadow ecosystems to understand what that maintenance looks like, because it is different than sort of a typical sort of English border or something like that. And part of that is just a really good understanding of the ecology of the meadow that you're working in and the plants that are in them, when they're actively growing, when they're going dormant, when they're going to seed, how they spread, is that by seed, is that by rhizome, just having a really good understanding of that. And so one of the nice things about overseeing the same garden space for many years is that it gives you an opportunity to have, through observation and working in the garden, develop a pretty keen understanding of how those different plants have these different sort of like timelines and cycles and modes of moving around, and how that's different from plant to plant, and it's different throughout the year. And so, for example, one of the really weedy grasses that we have been working really hard for a long time to get under control, and we're getting there, it's called Anthoxanthum odoratum, and sweet vernal grass is its common name. And it's a non-native grass that's from Eurasia that produces lots of seed and actually has the ability to sort of like outcompete many of our native meadow plants. And it's a common problem actually in the Garry Oak meadows in the wild as well. And one of the interesting things through just sort of observing the meadow in the first couple of years is that I noticed that it's the very first of the grasses in our meadow to bloom. It can be hard to find grasses in a meadow when everything's in bloom, but it's very easy if you know that sweet vernal grass is going to be the very first one. And so it depends on the season, but usually in late April, I start watching for it. And as soon as I see it blooming, it becomes one of the top priority things for me to do over the next 2 weeks. I have about a 2-week window where it's going to be the only grass that's in bloom in that meadow. And yeah, with one of the kind of approaches also in meadow gardening that I try and tell people, and particularly my staff, is that you don't have to know what every single plant is everywhere, but it's good to be on the lookout for anything that you don't recognize or that is new. So, let's say in our meadow we have 15 different sort of grasses. If I'm seeing a 16th, even if I haven't taken the time yet to figure out exactly what it is, I know it's arrived on its own. And that's not inherently a bad thing, but in the urban context, where there is a lot of invasive species pressure, I would say there's just as good a chance that this is a non-native grass as it is a native grass, and therefore I watch it very carefully and do my best to figure out what it is exactly as soon as I can, so I know what I'm dealing with.
And like knowing what blooms when, is that just something that you've learned over the years working with the garden?
Yeah, and so again, the Garry Oak meadow in particular is what's called a cool season meadow. These plants have this window of time, 4 months or so in the spring, where there's abundant water as a result of our winter wet. The warmth of the sun returns, and they grow really actively, and then when we get our summer drought coming on, they kind of go dormant. So almost everything in that meadow already happens during a very particular kind of point in time. And during that point in time, the Garry Oak meadow is my highest priority of all my garden areas. And then within the meadow, just kind of learning about the sequence of bloom and what's kind of coming when does come largely just from spending time in that garden. I always tell people that the best way to learn is to just start doing it, and you're going to make mistakes. But while you're doing it, kind of try and keep an eye on everything that's going on around you. And so, paying attention, even if you're just like weeding over here, but what's going on over there? And yeah, you do start to understand and over time kind of learn who's coming into bloom when, and even things like how long after they bloom do they take until the seed is mature. There are some weedy plants where I'm like, yeah, they're blooming right now, but I still have another month before the seed is ripe. And as long as I get in and weed it before then, I'm probably okay. Where there are other things where it's like, okay, the seed is going to be ripe by next week. I need to move quickly on this. And a lot of that really just comes from, experience, spending time in these gardens. There is information about these plants out there, and there's lots to be gained by reading books and things like that. But if I'm sitting at my desk reading about plants that are literally in my own garden, I think maybe the better way to learn is just to spend time with the plants, if that makes sense.
And plants in different areas are probably going to respond slightly differently.
Absolutely. And so when I was talking about how unique and special the Garry Oak meadow ecosystem is, not just here in the garden, but just like in the wild, I was talking a lot about sort of microsites and microclimates and things like that. And that is really, really it's not unique to the Garry Oak meadows, but it's really, really pronounced in the Garry Oak meadows. I mean, you can see it on the landscape where, like, out in the Garry Oak meadows on the island, if you're looking at them, and you just like see this band of yellow running through an otherwise pink meadow, you're like, oh, that's actually a seep. And there's a whole different suite of plants growing just with that little extra moisture. And the same thing does actually happen in the garden as well, on a smaller scale, and it's less dramatic. And because the garden is a smaller footprint, you don't read it the same way you would if you were reading the whole landscape. But there are definitely spots in the Garry Oak meadow where certain plants will be blooming 2 weeks before the exact same species, just in a different spot that's a little cooler, a little shadier. Things don't warm up as fast in the spring, and therefore, and again, because these are cool season meadows, they're really programmed. As soon as there's warmth and moisture, they're just off to the races. And so spots that warm up a little bit faster than others, everything in that spot will be that much further ahead. So even in the context of our relatively small garden, we end up with these sort of microclimates where the same plant might be a little bit further ahead in its phenology than in other areas.
The Garry Oak Meadow Garden is a unique and valuable resource, showcasing a variety of plant species and how they interact and grow in the wild. Visitors in the spring will be greeted with a landscape bursting with color. But even after the meadow's bloom is over, there is still so much more to appreciate and learn from this garden. The space was created and is maintained for more than just aesthetics, and learning about natural spaces within the province can foster a sense of connectedness and appreciation for nature for visitors to the garden. I found it inspiring to hear about how in tune Ben is with the meadow's seasonal changes, and how his understanding of the plants has grown through spending time with them. Having this experience and understanding is helpful in creating and maintaining an accurate Garry Oak meadow, but it's also applicable to gardening much more broadly. No book or article will teach you more than your garden can, if you take the time to pay attention, allow yourself to make mistakes, and enjoy the fact that the garden will be a little different every year. Thank you for listening to Garden Ecologies. This will be the final episode of this series, and as this project wraps up, I'm reflecting on what I've learned from my conversations with the horticulturists here at the UBC Botanical Garden. Though they all have unique backgrounds and perspectives that they bring to their work, I have noticed throughout all my conversations an emphasis on the importance of taking the time to get to know your garden, and how this can help you understand and work with the natural processes that occur within it in order to promote a resilient garden ecosystem. Working on this project has inspired me to think about gardening in a more experimental and collaborative way, and to get out in my own garden and try new things to see what I might learn. I hope that listening to these conversations has inspired you as well, and helped you to see things in a way that you wouldn't have expected. Thank you again for tuning in.